The morning of the launch was colder than expected. Gray clouds hung like judgment above the city's sleek skyline, a fitting backdrop for a day that was meant to dazzle. Inside the newly built glass and metal convention hall, hollow yet humming with anticipation, the final stage lighting adjustments flickered into place. Screens the size of billboards beamed muted animations, looping previews of a product that had already been hyped into legend by press leaks, cryptic blog posts, and controlled speculation. Outside, people lined up in expensive coats and curated outfits, waving their RFID invitations to the security scanners. Every guest had been vetted, badge-coded, and placed into tiers of importance. And yet, amid this calculated exclusivity, one man walked through the automatic doors without a badge, without a pass, without an escort. No one stopped him. They should have. He wasn't on the list, but he knew every name printed there. He had written them down himself once on a crumpled napkin in a cafe that no longer existed. Back when this wasn't a global event but a raw idea sketched in frustration. Back when he still believed in partnerships and trust and building something that would change the world. Now he believed in silence. In patience. In showing up when it mattered most. He walked through the side hallway where staff bustled in headset-driven urgency and no one noticed the man in the hoodie moving like he belonged. And in a way he did. More than any of them. More than the developers giving media interviews or the marketing team rehearsing their taglines. He belonged because this was his. They had erased his name from the final patent. They had locked him out of the cloud source when he started asking too many questions. They had buried his contributions under layers of committee revisions and brand alignment. They thought they could edit him out of the narrative. But the code still bore his fingerprints. The hardware still followed his blueprint. The user interface still moved with the gestures he had envisioned years ago, alone in a basement room lit by nothing but belief. As the main event room filled, the lights dimmed. A voice announced the keynote speaker. The crowd erupted into a carefully engineered cheer. From his place at the edge of the crowd, he watched the screens flicker to life. The promotional video began slow, dramatic. A story about change, innovation, legacy. A narrator intoned phrases about visionaries and collective genius, but not once did the name Jalen Brooks appear. His name. It wasn't rage that burned in his chest. It was clarity. A quiet, sharpening sword of pain. The kind that didn't scream. The kind that moved. At the far end of the showroom, past the espresso bar and the press lounge, was the prototype display table. Surrounded by velvet rope and guarded by two PR assistants, the device sat atop a glowing pedestal, small, sleek, and pulsing faintly as if breathing. It was beautiful. It was his. He approached. No hesitation. No permission. The moment his fingers touched the edge of the device, a young staffer's voice cut the air. "Hey, don't touch that." Heads turned. The word janitor might as well have been implied in her tone, her expression. It was the expression of someone trained to police the perimeter but never taught the history of the product she was protecting. He looked up. Behind her, the promo loop continued. Images of code notebooks. Pencil sketches. A blurred close-up of handwritten notes in a thick-bound book. It wasn't blurred enough. He recognized the tilt of the letters, the way the dashes angled under the lowercase y. It was his handwriting. They had used footage from his original pitch without credit. A full frame of stolen authorship glowing 10 feet tall for an audience that didn't know. But now they would. He reached into his hoodie, removed a thin tablet, activated a preloaded program. It ran instantly, broadcasting a new signal to the showroom screens via an exploit he had written years ago, a debug tool that had never been deleted from the core OS. The screens blinked. The promo loop froze. And then, a new image. A photo. Him. Younger. Standing beside the first whiteboard prototype. Then code lines, annotated in his writing. Then emails. Timestamps. Authorship logs. Design proofs. Silence swallowed the room. People looked at one another. The keynote speaker froze on stage, mouthing words to an assistant. Security moved. Too late. He stepped back from the display. Let the device glow behind him. Let the audience absorb the truth they were never meant to see. He didn't shout, didn't claim revenge. He just looked into the cameras now being turned toward him and held his own product in his hand. Because it was his, and this was his launch now. For a moment, everything froze. It wasn't the kind of pause that comes from confusion. It was that rare, electric stillness that descends when a system breaks in public. When something not only goes wrong, but exposes what should never have been seen. Jalen stood under the flickering screens, surrounded by a slowly widening radius of stunned silence. His face, now fully illuminated across 3 LED walls, was no longer anonymous. His name, once buried in NDAs and contract footnotes, scrolled in stark black text above company slogans he had helped write. Jalen Brooks, original architect of Project Osiris. Security didn't react at first. Their radios crackled, their feet uncertain. The executives huddled offstage, whispering frantically. No one knew if they should run, shout, or salvage. The launch was live. There were investors in the crowd. Cameras everywhere. Any move would be permanent. And he knew it. That was the design of it. Jalen didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he held the prototype in both hands like it was something sacred. This was the real power, not just the machine but the moment. The proof. The audacity to return not with accusation but with truth. Truth big enough to crash through curated narratives and brand mythology. Behind him, the screens continued scrolling schematics, design iterations, voice memos recorded years earlier. One clip played his voice softly narrating a design breakthrough. The interface should feel like breath. It shouldn't instruct. It should respond. The room was full of people who had parroted that same phrase in press interviews, never knowing they were quoting the very man now standing in silence before them. Finally, movement. 2 security officers approached from opposite sides of the floor, their eyes cautious, hands twitching at their hips, as if uncertain whether they were walking toward a trespasser or a founder. Jalen didn't resist. He handed the device to the closer guard. "You sure about that?" the man asked under his breath, confused. Jalen said nothing. They escorted him out the side door. But he didn't look back. He didn't have to, because the system he'd built had already done the rest. Outside, the sky had turned the color of damp steel. News vans were already arriving. Word had spread. The glitch, if they could still call it that, was trending on every platform. Hashtag Who is Jalen Brooks? Hashtag Osiris Stolen. Hashtag Founders Ghost. Inside the building, panic had taken hold. Executives scrambled to prepare statements. The PR team locked down social media. A committee was formed on the spot to draft a clarifying document. But it was already too late, because the real evidence was not the video that had played on the screens. It was the data he had seeded across the cloud in the months leading up to the launch. Encrypted packets that only activated once the final build of Osiris was booted for launch. A fingerprint inside the source code, undeniable and irreversible. Every line of foundational architecture carried a watermark now, visible only to the compilers. And the compilers were running all over the world, on the reviewers' machines, in the demo models, in the private testing units already sent to key investors. Every time the product was activated, the code itself confirmed, designed by Jalen Brooks. Later that night, in a small borrowed apartment 5 blocks away, Jalen sat on the floor beside an empty coffee table, watching the world catch up to the truth. His phone buzzed constantly, old contacts, journalists, bloggers, lawyers. Some messages were urgent. Some were apologetic. Some were predatory. All of them wanted something now. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he stared at the blank wall ahead of him, a reflection of all the times he had been dismissed, undercut, erased. And now vindicated. But there was no joy in it. Only clarity. This had never been about getting his name back. It had been about breaking the pattern. Because he wasn't the first to be stolen from. And if this launch had gone unchecked, he wouldn't be the last. He opened his laptop, typed one word into a folder directory. Reclaim. Inside, a list of projects began to populate: companies he had once freelanced for, apps he had helped build, patents he had signed away for next to nothing. Not anymore. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just reclaim. He would relaunch. The next day, the silence ended. By morning, his name was everywhere. Not just on tech blogs or startup gossip columns, but on the home pages of national news outlets, business sections, and financial wire feeds. The ghost founder. The man behind Osiris. Stolen genius. Photos from the launch event, him standing with the prototype, the screens behind him frozen mid-exposure, circulated with captions as dramatic as they were incomplete. And yet, not one headline asked the question that mattered: why was he erased in the first place? Jalen read none of them. His focus was elsewhere. The plan that had lived in the back of his mind for 2 years, the plan he didn't dare speak aloud even in the deepest corners of his solitude, was now unfolding in real time. Phase 2 was no longer a concept. It was motion. He moved out of the city before noon. Took nothing but a hard drive, a backpack, and a burner phone. No one could know where he was. Not yet. Because while the world buzzed about vindication and betrayal, he was building something far more dangerous than a scandal. He was building an alternative. Not a lawsuit. Not revenge. A better system. One they couldn't bury. He drove north to an old acquaintance's property, a disused barn turned into a makeshift fabrication lab. It smelled of dust, solder, and potential. There, he met with a handful of developers, engineers, and ex-colleagues who had quietly followed his story, each of them touched in some way by the silent theft of their own labor. A designer whose pitch deck had been stolen and published under a new name. A coder whose GitHub repository was forked and monetized without consent. A security architect forced out of a startup after building the core of their infrastructure. Together, they weren't just survivors. They were witnesses. And now they were allies. Over the next 72 hours, Jalen barely slept. The prototype in his bag wasn't the one from the showroom floor, it was his own unit. An earlier, unbranded version of Osiris, built before his name had been cut from the documentation, before the logo had been polished and the interface sanitized for mass appeal. This version had no splash screen. No permissions gates. No forced data telemetry. It wasn't built for the market. It was built for people. They began adapting it, stripping the corporate dependencies, removing the hidden analytics, rewriting the OS for open deployment. They designed new tools, secure messaging, decentralized networking, full control over memory and cache. No data harvesting. No third-party logging. Just code and control. What they were building wasn't a product. It was a protest. A new launch. Meanwhile, the company behind Osiris, still stumbling from the fallout of the launch event, held emergency board meetings behind closed doors. Stock had dipped. 3 investors had frozen funding pending clarity on IP disputes. The PR team was in meltdown. Legal counsels issued cease and desist warnings to publications using Jalen's footage. But it didn't matter. Because on the 4th night, a website appeared. ReclaimOS.net. Simple. Plain. Quiet. It featured only one video, Jalen in front of a blank backdrop, speaking softly and without bitterness. He told the real story. Not with blame, but with facts. He explained the origin of Osiris. The months in his basement. The sketches. The first prototype. The idea that was born from frustration not with technology, but with who controlled it. He ended the video with a promise. This time, it belongs to all of us. No more gatekeepers. No more signatures on your silence. Then the screen faded to a download button. Reclaim OS, open beta. Within hours, it spread like fire through hacker communities, tech freedom forums, indie developers, digital rights groups. By morning, the first major article appeared. The clean version of Osiris has arrived, and it's free. Jalen stood outside the barn as the sky turned pale with morning. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of momentum. They tried to steal the product. They tried to silence the creator. But they had forgotten one thing. He had already built the backdoor. And now he had built the future. The open-source release detonated across the internet like a controlled explosion. Precise, intentional, and impossible to ignore. By the time the corporate attorneys reached the domain registrar for Reclaim OS, mirrors of the project had already been uploaded to decentralized repositories around the globe. Forked, cloned, protected. They couldn't kill it. And worse, they couldn't own it. That was the true threat Jalen had unleashed. Not a viral video, not a scandalous keynote disruption, but something deeper, more dangerous. A product that proved they weren't needed. The company that had erased him was now watching as millions flocked not to the OS they had stolen, but to the version the people could trust. Because trust had never been part of their model. They sold control disguised as convenience. Jalen was offering something else entirely. The first week, Reclaim OS hit 1 million downloads. By week 2, it was running on modified tablets in schools, in grassroots NGOs, in shelters and clinics where surveillance was a threat, not a feature. Developers praised the modularity. Artists praised the ethics. Activists praised the privacy. It was lean, flexible, and most importantly, clean. No telemetry, no spyware, no gatekeeping. It wasn't just a tool. It was a statement. Inside corporate headquarters, panic metastasized. Board members fought behind frosted glass, while PR teams issued vague apologies about oversights in development acknowledgments. It was too late. Every attempt to regain control only proved the core of the accusation. They had built a palace on stolen foundation. The company's CEO, once the poster child for visionary innovation, was now a man trapped in a cage of his own ambition. Every time he stepped on stage, someone in the crowd asked about Jalen. Every time he posted a statement, 1,000 replies echoed the same word, reclaim. No court injunction could stop the bleeding, because Reclaim OS wasn't a single site. It was an idea with legs. Every developer that contributed made it stronger. Every mirror made it more permanent. Every user who installed it declared they'd had enough of being sold back their own data. And Jalen? Jalen didn't watch it grow like a king overseeing his kingdom. He disappeared into the code. He spent his days reviewing pull requests, fixing bugs, responding to user feedback. His name wasn't at the top of the homepage. He didn't want it there. He was tired of chasing credit. He was chasing impact now. Still, he knew they weren't done with him. The company couldn't destroy the OS, so they turned to him instead. First came the character attacks, old videos taken out of context, quotes fabricated and fed to tabloids, whispers of instability. Then came the legal threats, cease and desist orders, threats of IP theft, claims of breach of fiduciary duty, from a company that had already voided his equity. Jalen didn't flinch. Instead, he dropped another layer of truth. Emails, internal communications, leaked chat logs showing how they'd orchestrated his erasure. Screenshots of executive meetings where the decision to omit his name was casually agreed upon over lunch. The dam broke. Former employees came forward. Quiet ones, janitors, coders, admin assistants who had seen too much and said too little. They spoke out. And the internet listened. Jalen had never wanted to be a symbol. But now he was. Not for rebellion. For reclamation. One night, as news outlets breathlessly tracked the collapse of the company's stock value, a single image began to circulate. A handwritten sign taped to the glass wall of the now-empty Osiris showroom where the original product launch had been staged. Don't touch that. But it was his all along. Beneath it, someone had scrawled 2 words in black marker. We remember. And under that, #reclaim everything. The building was abandoned now. Where once there were velvet ropes and spotlights, only dust remained. The showroom that had launched Osiris, the one that had silenced his voice and mocked his presence, was now sealed with rusted locks. Glass walls were smudged with fingerprints of protesters who had once gathered outside, holding cardboard signs with words Jalen never asked for but couldn't ignore. He passed by it quietly that morning, hood up, face obscured not by fear but by choice. The world had begun to rewire itself around the story, reorienting the narrative from scandal to reckoning. Reclaim OS was no longer a project. It was a movement. The mirrors of the operating system had spread across the world like mycelium, each node self-sustaining, unkillable. In Venezuela, journalists used it to safely file their reports. In Myanmar, dissidents ran it on bootable thumb drives hidden in clothing. In Detroit, a community center used refurbished tablets powered by Reclaim to teach kids who'd never owned a computer. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polished. But it was theirs. And that made all the difference. At a downtown co-working space in a new city, Jalen entered under a different name. He didn't need legacy anymore. He needed space. Tools. Quiet. He sat in the back, behind glass walls that felt eerily familiar, watching new developers join the next phase of the movement. They didn't recognize him. Not right away. Some of them whispered, but none of them approached. It was better that way. He wasn't here to give speeches. He was building again. Reclaim OS was only the beginning. The deeper truth, the one he'd come to understand late one night while watching feedback roll in from war zones and prisons and schools and shelters, was this: it had never been about a single device or even a single injustice. It was about permission. Who had the right to build? Who had the right to be seen? Who had the right to touch what they had made? The corporate world had drawn thick borders around creation, signed contracts, controlled access, NDA-powered erasure. Jalen was done with that. That week, he pushed the first lines of a new framework. Feral, a decentralized toolkit for independent inventors. Hardware agnostic, self-governing, unpatentable by design. It would allow inventors to register their own contributions publicly, encrypted, and immutable. A global authorship ledger. Part blockchain, part manifesto. It would burn the old approval structures to the ground. Already, teams were forming. An engineer in Nairobi wanted to adapt Reclaim for power grids. A midwife in Palestine was coding a medical record tool that would work offline. An artist in rural Ohio had rewritten the interface to be navigable by voice only for her blind brother. Jalen wasn't their leader. He was their mirror. Proof that you didn't have to wait for permission to begin. The company behind Osiris tried one final gambit, a relaunch under a new name, stripped of its history, redesigned with sleek distraction and new slogans. But the code was still his. Within an hour of the new version's launch, Reclaim developers had already dissected it, posted a teardown online, and traced the original framework back to Jalen's source tree. No one bought it. The press didn't cover the event. Investors stopped returning calls. The showroom was now a museum to a failure they couldn't spin. And the only thing anyone remembered was the man who touched what was his and made it everyone's. They tried to rewrite him, erase him from the patents, silence him at the launch, bury him in legal mud while smiling for cameras. But history is not written by the ones who steal. It is written by the ones who build. And Jalen Brooks had built more than an operating system. He had built a blueprint for reclamation. Months had passed since the Osiris crash. The company was a shell now, propped up by non-disclosure agreements and the inertia of old money. Its logo, once etched on everything from subway ads to skyscraper billboards, had been quietly removed from the streets. The investors had moved on. The boardroom lights dimmed, but the world hadn't stopped moving. In a crowded auditorium lit by recycled LEDs and lined with folding chairs, hundreds of people gathered. There were no VIP lanyards, no velvet ropes, no security scanning QR codes at the door. There were engineers with duct-taped laptops, teachers with sketchpads, teenagers with bright eyes and code on their fingers. They came not for spectacle, but for a system that finally belonged to them. It was the first Reclaim Summit. There were no main stages, only circles, workshops, shared screens, idea boards that spanned the walls like constellations of change. Jalen walked through the gathering quietly, hoodie drawn low, backpack loose across his shoulders. He didn't speak much, didn't stand at the center. He floated from circle to circle, listening, watching, building quietly alongside the others. They knew who he was, but they treated him not like a prophet, like a peer. That was the success. He had made himself obsolete, and in doing so made the world more possible. Later that evening, in a corner of the summit, someone had set up a projection of the original launch. The moment where the showroom lights had frozen. The audio drop. The shout. "Don't touch that." The crowd watched it again. This time not with rage, but awe. Because now they understood. That moment wasn't defiance. It was ownership. Jalen stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets. Someone handed him a marker. Beside the screen, a blank wall stood waiting, inviting each person to write a sentence about what they'd reclaimed. He stepped forward, wrote 5 words, built it, lost it, returned anyway, then stepped back. The wall filled with phrases. I reclaimed my voice. I reclaimed my tools. I reclaimed my time. I reclaimed my future. And finally, don't touch that. But it was ours all along. Outside, the night was quiet. A wind moved through the trees with a rhythm that sounded like possibility. Jalen disappeared down the street. Not famous, not forgotten, but free. And that, more than anything, was the product he had always wanted to launch. Reclaim complete. Story closed. System running. And